know what quote mining is, right? I didn't. I only found out this phrase relatively recently. I was on a video with Irish Tommy, and I was trying to make a point, and in the chat, somebody said something, and I said, hey, that's not the point I was making. They basically quoted me, but they almost like they took my quote and they sort of twisted it around and said, no, that's not what I meant. And Irish Tommy said, well, they're quote mining. That's what they're doing. I said, I'd never heard of that phrase before. And I said, what is that? He said, well, it's what's just happened. He says, when somebody, you said you could speak for 5 minutes, he said you could be making a point, and there might be one little phrase within that 5 minutes, and someone will take that, they'll use it as a quote, and they'll sort of use it against you. He said, and, sort of disregard the point of what you were saying, the gist, and just use that. And I only mentioned that with regard to the Alan Pardew stuff. Not that I'm accusing anyone of using it badly or anything like that. My point wasn't, as a few people have said, you want Alan Pardew in. Alan Pardew's not my first choice or anything like it. Alan Pardew was only a choice based on the restrictions that the board had put in place for hiring a new manager. I would have liked Vincent Kompany back in November. And there are other managers as well. But bearing in mind we've got these restrictions in place as to who we can hire, I thought he met their criteria, basically. But I wouldn't have put the restrictions in the first place. Quite frankly, I think we should be going and looking for some of these young, bright, up-and-coming managers like the bloke that Brighton got. Anyway, we've discussed this before. You don't need me to discuss that again. The reason I want to talk about it today is because the boards have really leaked, and they've leaked to everyone, 4 reasons. They haven't named it 4 reasons, but there are 4 reasons. 4 reasons why we can't replace David Moyes. Why David Moyes is going to retain his job. Why they won't hire somebody else. And I've looked at them and I thought, wow, this is an interesting dynamic. How have they managed this? I'd love to be a fly on the wall for the conversation between Daniel Kretinsky and David Sullivan. They can't both be in agreement on this. Surely not. Because, well, the 4 things all have very, very obvious counter-arguments, and you would expect when, let's say, one of them, let's say if it was, whatever, it doesn't matter, but when one of them comes up with these 4 things, you'd expect the other one to criticise them and basically debunk them either way, whether it's Kretinsky's idea or Sullivan's idea. So let me just tell you what the 4 things are here. The first one is so cliched. There are no candidates available. That's where the Alan Pardew thing came from. Basically, no, I'll go through the 4 and we'll break them down systematically. David Moyes is the perfect manager for a relegation fight. We actually dealt with that yesterday, so we don't need to spend any time on that at all. Number 3, sacking David Moyes is a risk. I mean, I know you're watching this video now. You'll say you're doing the counter arguments now. I know that. You know it. I know it. I can't understand why somebody at the club doesn't. Number 4, bringing someone in is costly. Yeah, I mean, insert what you think just there, basically. This is crazy talk. I mean, it really is. Let's just go for the first one, really. There are no candidates available. Well, there's no candidates available, and this is, as I say, it's where the Pardew thing came from, because you've restricted yourself by your own parameters. You won't go out and find the latest coach. You won't go out and... I mentioned yesterday, the club apparently like Thomas Frank now. Well, that's no good. You won't get Thomas Frank now. The trick is spot him when he's at Brondby. That's the thing. We've just been whooped 4-0. By the Brighton, well, I say by the Brighton manager, by the Brighton assistant manager, but the Brighton manager was up in the stands. No point looking at him now. You won't get him now. You've got to look at him when he's at Shakhtar. But we don't look at those. So here's the thing: we've got this restricted little set of parameters. Like, oh no, we can't go and hire a foreign coach because, of course, they're no good, are they? Do you know what I mean? The ones that haven't worked in the Premier League, even though clearly they are, they're absolutely brilliant. A lot of them. You've got to have someone with Premier League experience. So we would dismiss that. So whilst everyone else is going out finding these young coaches, we're still fawning over Rafa Benitez, like we've learnt nothing. Rafa Benitez is yesterday's man. Just a lot of people would suggest David Moyes is yesterday's man. So why would you carry on doing what you got wrong? So basically, they have to have Premier League experience and they have to be available. Well, immediately, you're cutting it down. Aston Villa didn't care that Emery wasn't available. They just paid for Real 6 million, whatever it cost. I think it was 6 million euros, and they went and got their man. Simple as that. That's when it came into Alan Pardew. So I'll ask you one simple question here, right? One simple question. Let's say we need 5 wins to keep us safe. It doesn't matter. Whatever. Let's just call it 5 wins. You could call it 4 wins and 3 draws, whatever. Let's say 5 wins for argument's sake. Do you have faith in David Moyes getting those 5 wins? In fact, scrap that. Let's do a would you think. Okay, some people say Kevin Keane. Mentioned him yesterday, by the way. I was quote mined on that. I don't want Kevin Keane in place. I'm just putting it out there, all right? Because people have been saying it. Who do you think is more likely to get 5 wins? Kevin Keane in charge or David Moyes? I suspect we don't really know. We can't tell. It's impossible to tell. He's doing great doing great things with the under-18s. I'll give you one here. Who's more likely to get 5 points, to get 5 wins between now and the end of the season? David Moyes or Harry Redknapp? I mean, and you answer it honestly. I'm talking about league wins here. Forget Europe and all that stuff. I look at it, I think, well, probably Harry Redknapp. I think he'd probably come in. I think, who's going to get more of a tune-up Paqueta? Redknapp or Moyes? Who's going to get Scamacca playing again? I think probably more likely Redknapp. Best out of Ben Rama, Redknapp. And I know there may be some who say, well, hold on, he won't be as good as defending won't be as good as David Moyes. Well, let's just, they should have scored 6, really, Brighton. Let's not pretend our defence is good. And that's what I said to Pardew. Who's more likely to get us 5 wins now and the end of the season? Well, I think probably Pardew. Not because he's absolutely brilliant, but I think he'd motivate the players. I think he'd come in. I think he'd get them excited. He'd get them motivated. I think he'd get us attacking. That's where that came from. But I don't think we should be restricted by those parameters. The point is, well, they say there's no candidates available. Yes, there are. There are candidates available. The point of the matter is you put restrictions in, and actually the ones overseas you don't know. You don't know, because at the moment you've got a sporting director. There should have been a sporting director there anyway, and actually when you lose your manager, you know who you're going to get in next. Or when you've lost faith in your manager, you've already got a list of players because your sporting directors said, sorry, not a list of players, list of managers, because your sporting director said, oh, right, that this guy in the Bundesliga is doing well, this guy in Portugal is doing well. You already know them. Now we don't. Make no mistake about it. When Thomas Frank was ripping it up at Bromley, we didn't have a clue who he was. We didn't know about the Brighton manager till he rocked up at Brighton, and that's just the way it is at West Ham. Point number 2, Moyes the perfect manager for relegation fight. I dealt with this yesterday. It's not the same relegation fight. There's no new manager bounce for him coming in. He did get Sunderland relegated, and he's not walking in to a club that has got a bunch of journeyman pros in there. It's not like Moyes is walking in with fresh ideas. He can't. It's not fresh ideas. The players aren't going to say, oh, that's a good idea. That's a fresh one. We haven't heard that before. They've heard it too much. The players don't look... Well, the players don't look interested. Let's be fair. Let's not let them off the hook here. They were awful against Brighton, by the way. But my point is, he's not walking in to a downtrodden relegation club. He's walking into a club that have just recently spent £200 million on players, have got Brazil's playmaker in the team, have got a load of players who've got, just in central defenders, have got nearly £70 million worth of central defender in there. This is not it. Actually, I would suggest you don't need a firefighter necessarily to come in. What you need is someone to come in with fresh ideas. It's basically the parameters and the qualities that David Moyes used to need are not really relevant in this instance, because I just don't think he can get the best out of the players. So I don't think he is. I don't think Moyes is the perfect manager for a relegation fight. Well, it depends who you're talking about, but not always. Not at Sunderland he wasn't, and I don't think he is at West Ham. Because I think if you don't bring someone in, you don't get that new manager bounce. It might be enough. We talk about 5 wins. The new manager bounce might be enough for 5 wins. Point number 3. Sacking David Moyes is a risk. I've said it before, you know what I'm going to say. Keeping David Moyes is the risk. It's put out there like everything else is a risk, and that's the safe thing to do. The safe thing to do is keeping David Moyes. Do I really need to say any more about it? I mean, how can he be seen as a safe pair of hands at the moment? You've got to delve back into the archives and into history, and I mean into him doing well for us when we were in Europe, getting us into Europe, to think he's the man to keep us up. Honestly, he looks like a broken man on that touchline. I mean, the risk is sticking with him. I suggest there's less risk. The gamble's not in recruiting somebody else. The gamble is keeping him. I'm not saying the other thing is not a gamble. Going and getting a new manager, of course that would be a gamble. But keeping him's a gamble as well. You know, it's not one or the other. You're not choosing between something that's really risky and something that's risk-free. That's not the case. Keeping David Moyes is not risk-free. Number 4 might be the worst of the lot. I don't know. You tell me. Bringing someone in is costly. Oh, my goodness. Let's go. Let's use Unai Emery as an example, because Well, because he was 6 million. He was €6 million to get him out of the Villarreal contract. Now, I'm not suggesting we could even go and get someone like that. I think that horse has bolted. You know, Aston Villa did two things really well. Number one is they paid the compensation. Number two, they highlighted early that they could see. They had foresight that Steven Gerrard wasn't going to do well there. But actually, the 6 million when set against the cost of relegation is not much. I mean, it's unbelievable. Bringing someone in is costly. I tell you what, not half as costly as getting relegated, that's for sure. That's the costly thing. And this is what I don't understand, and this is why I bring in the Sullivan and Kretinsky dynamic. At one point, either they both agree instantly that that's the case. They both hold that same opinion at exactly the same time. Or one of them says it. And if that's the case, it's one of them's opinion. Bear in mind, they're both successful businessmen. At the point where one of them says, oh, do you know what? Bringing someone in might be quite expensive. It might cost us some money. You would expect the other one to come back with the obvious counter-argument. The counter-argument you were all shouting at your phone when I just said that, which is, well, getting relegated is going to cost you a load of money. That's the costly thing. It makes no sense at all. I said recently, and look, these are not my figures. They're Sean Whetstone's figures. I've got no reason to disbelieve them at all. If we were to get relegated and we didn't come back at the first attempt or something like that, we had a couple of seasons in the Championship, it would cost the club £500 million. That's £500 million. You didn't need me to do the maths breakdown, really. You knew that yourselves. It sort of makes sense, doesn't it, really? 200 million at least turnover a season in the Premier League. You can absolutely see how it could cost us £500 million. Placed against that, it's ridiculous. Placed against the value of the club being 700 million. I mean, I got some thoughts about the David Gold shares and the value of those and the difference, the difference that makes to the Gold estate and to David Gold's children and whatnot. I don't particularly want to go into it now. Only because it's a little bit too soon. I think it's a little bit too soon. I think the family is still in mourning, and there's nothing against them actually. I'll discuss it another time. But let's just say this much: the value of the club is 700 million. Or that's the valuation. I think if you take the shares, the number of shares that Daniel Kretinsky bought, and you extrapolate that into the full 100% of shares, I think the club is valued at about 700 million. Not if we get relegated, it's not. It's just not. And when you factor that in, you think, really? 700? So you look at these figures, 700 million, the club, £500 million for, cost us staying down and getting relegated. When you start putting those figures in, really? Bringing someone in is costly. Paying a club the compensation for their manager is costly. It's ridiculous. I mean, and it's also completely hypocritical. The club have just spent 15 million, or pledged to spend 15 million, let's put it that way, on Danny Ings, plus £100,000 a week. They've done that to keep us up. So where's the continuity in decision making there? So you think you're willing? I don't know. Let's say Danny Ings' contract is 15 to 20 million. I don't think that's fair. 100 grand a week. It will be something like that. And his transfer fee is 15 million. So Danny Ings is not a player for the long term. Danny Ings has been signed, so £30 million worth of financial commitment to keep us up in a striker. Yet for some reason they're quibbling over giving. I mean, and that was Emery. Now, most managers are not going to take 6 million to get. So let's say the board are probably quibbling over 3 million to get somebody out of their contract. Really? 10% of what it will cost for Danny Ings? It's inconsistent. It's nonsense. It's rubbish. I'll tell you what I think. Here's what I think about it. I think that's rubbish. I think they know that as well as you and I do. Sacking David Moyes is a risk? I think they know. Keeping David Moyes is a risk? I think they know that. Moyes is the perfect manager for the relegation fight? I think there's an element of that they might believe it, but I also think they probably know. They probably listened to Declan Rice's press conference, or his interview, should I say, they've probably seen David Moyes' demeanour. They've probably seen that he's struggling to motivate the players and not particularly believing in or even understanding the tactical message. They've probably seen the dynamic between the fans and David Moyes change. So, again, they probably know that that's not true. And I think it takes us back to point number one, which there are no candidates available. I think they know, they absolutely know, all those three. Bringing someone in, I think they'd probably pay it. Second, David Moyes is a risk. I think they know it's keeping him as a risk. Perfect manager for relegation, I think they probably know it's not. It comes back to point number one. There are no candidates available. There are, and here's where West Ham are in major trouble. I think there's probably a load of candidates who could probably do the job, and with the talent on display at West Ham, produce an outcome over the last few games of the 5 wins that could give us enough performances which would make us better than Southampton or better than Everton, better than Forest, better than Bournemouth, whatever. That's what you've got to do, better than Leeds. That person is out there, and I think there's more than one of them. Here's the problem. I don't think the board have got a clue who they are.